Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Before we begin our analysis, I would like to remind you that if you're finding our initiatives to be helpful, please like our videos, share your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So, with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 7 of the Delhi edition. In this column, the writers examine the draft regulations that were brought out by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change on EPR or Extended Producer Responsibility concerning the management of plastic waste in the country. These draft regulations were notified by the ministry in the month of October and it is all set to come into effect next year. But since the draft EPR regulations were brought out by the ministry, it has attracted a lot of controversy and it has been criticized by environmental activists. So the writers of the column thoroughly examine these regulations and they go on to identify the gaps which could weaken our plastic waste management approach, and they even label it a retrograde step by the ministry. But before we talk about the draft EPR regulations, first you need to understand what is EPR. What is Extended Producer Responsibility? See, EPR or Extended Producer Responsibility is a concept in waste management. As per this concept, the producer of a product has an extended responsibility throughout the life cycle of the product in order to ensure its scientific disposal, recycling, and reuse. See, generally it is assumed that a producer's responsibility is limited to the stage of production, sales, and consumption and service. Once a product is bought and consumed by the consumer, it is later disposed of, thus generating different categories of waste. It could be solid waste, plastic waste, electronic waste, etc. So now, once the product has become a waste material, the question is, who has the responsibility to process and handle this waste? Should it be the consumer, or the government, or the informal waste processing channels that exist in India? The answer is that this responsibility does not lie with any of them. It doesn't lie with the consumer, nor exactly with the government or the informal sector. The responsibility of implementing scientific waste management in the life cycle of a product lies with the producer, and this concept is referred to as extended producer responsibility. It means that the producer's responsibility is not just limited to production, sales, consumption, and service, but the producer shall be held liable and responsible even at the end of the life cycle of a product, that is, while dealing with its disposal, scientific collection and segregation, and as well as recycle and reuse. So, under the concept of EPR, producers have been given the responsibility to establish a closed loop to provide for the disposal, recycling, and reuse of the product at the end of its life cycle. So, this concept in waste management is being implemented in India through our waste management rules, such as the solid waste management rules, plastic waste management rules, and of course, the electronic waste management rules. The concept of EPR or extended producer responsibility has been inculcated in these rules, thus making it the responsibility of the producer to deal with the end of life cycle of a product. So, for example, if a FMCG company, if it is producing a product that is packaged in a plastic material, then the company should not only account for the cost of production, manufacturing, packing, and distribution, but it should also account for the cost of collection, recycling, and reuse of the plastic packaging material. But the writers who examine the draft EPR regulations, they point out that the latest proposed guidelines of the government goes against the true principle of EPR and it weakens the solid waste management rules and plastic waste management rules of the country. They note this as a retrograde backward step and go on to justify their argument by pointing out three specific gaps in the draft regulations. The first major flaw, according to the writers, is that the draft regulations have excluded the informal sector. See, it's a well established fact that in India, majority of the waste management is handled by the informal sector. Even though India is one of the largest producers of plastic waste, the formal channels for treating and handling this waste is very limited, whereas majority of the task is carried out by the informal sector. The government itself has acknowledged this fact in the Swachh Bharat Mission Plastic Waste Book and recognizes the important role being played by waste collectors and rag pickers in disposing harmful waste, which is not only helping us tackle pollution but is also helping in promoting recycling and reuse in the industry. According to estimates, there are around 1.5 to 4 million rag pickers who are playing a critical role in waste management, but they do not enjoy any kind of livelihood security or social security. As they deal with waste management, usually in the unscientific manner, they are exposed to a lot of hazardous substances, thus threatening their health and well being. But their role in waste management is largely unacknowledged, and they don't enjoy any benefits of health insurance, minimum wages, or basic protective gear. So, according to the writers, the draft EPR regulations were a golden opportunity to recognize the informal sector as one of the key stakeholders in waste management and provide for the formalization of the informal sector. But contrary to this expectation, the draft regulations notified by the ministry has completely excluded the informal sector and makes no mention of informal waste collectors and rag pickers. Instead, it has placed the responsibility entirely on the producers and it encourages the producers to create a parallel chain through private investments through which plastic waste could be managed and handled in the country. So the writers argue that the exclusion of the informal sector will not only hit the livelihoods of these rag pickers and waste collectors, but it will also result in duplication, thus leading to wasteful expenditure on the part of the producers. Under the new draft guidelines, producers are being encouraged to make fresh private investments to create a parallel waste management infrastructure, which would end up hurting the informal sector that already exists. Plus, this approach also deprives the producers of making use of the several advantages offered by the informal sector, which is already managing India's plastic waste quite effectively. So, the writers point out the exclusion of the informal sector as a stakeholder is a major mistake, which could not only threaten the livelihoods of the informal workers, but will also lead to duplication. Hence, they're calling upon the government to review the draft guidelines and provide for the formalization of the informal sector. The second flaw they identify is with regard to the manner in which the draft guidelines is treating and handling different types of plastic. See, if you go through the draft guidelines, you will notice that the regulations are being limited to plastic packaging. It doesn't include single use plastic and throwaway plastic, and it also excludes multi layered and multi material plastic. See, plastic packaging made from rigid plastics is easier to handle and process, and technologically it is more convenient to recycle and reuse such rigid plastics. But the real challenge and problem comes up with single use plastics, throwaway plastics, and multi material, multi layered plastics, which are very light and also abundant because of their widespread usage in the economy, thus making it much more challenging to collect the waste and to handle and process the waste. The writers point out that plastic packaging can be divided into three categories. We have recyclable variety of plastics, which is already being effectively handled by the informal sector. Second, we have technologically recyclable plastic, but it's not economically viable to invest in this waste management. So companies, producers generally stay away from touching such plastic waste. The third category refers to that kind of plastic which is technologically very challenging to process and recycle, and hence they're often treated as non recyclable. So, based on this classification, the writers hope that the government should have provided for extended coverage of all different types of plastic. See, for example, rigid plastic materials made up of PET and HDPE. They are much more easier to collect, handle, and process, and this is already being done by the informal sector. But unfortunately, the regulations are focused more on rigid plastics, and it is asking the industry, the producers, to invest in handling and processing rigid plastics. So extended producer responsibility is mainly being extended to rigid plastics, whereas the real challenge is in recycling and processing flexible plastic and multi-layered multi-material plastic. Plastic material made up of LDPE or PP plastics. They are very light in weight and they are widely used across different sectors. And it is technologically challenging and economically unviable to handle and process this waste. This is where the producers could have worked with the informal sector to create an efficient waste management channel. But the draft rules have largely excluded flexible plastics and multi-layered multi-material plastics. The third major flaw in the regulation is that it encourages investments in end-of-life processing of plastic waste, which could be very harmful to the environment and as well as to human health and human safety. See, those kinds of plastic which can't be recycled, it will be pushed for end-of-life processing, where the plastic is either burnt or incinerated, or it is pushed through other processes such as chemical recycling and pyrolysis. The problem with these processing methods is that burning and incineration releases a lot of harmful pollutants into the environment, and also a lot of toxins are released which threaten human safety and human health. Then processing plants which employ chemical recycling, pyrolysis, etc., they are considered as risky industries because they often report a number of accidents which results in industrial disasters like explosions, industrial fires, etc. So the draft regulations are encouraging such harmful end-of-life processing techniques which pose a threat to the environment, to human health, and to human safety. So the writers suggest that instead of promoting end-of-life processing, which is dangerous and harmful, the government should be working with the producers and the informal sector to collect and scientifically process this waste so that such harmful plastic is brought back into the cycle where the material could be reused by the industry. And for those plastics which are almost non-recyclable, safer alternatives for end-life processing should be encouraged, which currently is not being done by the policy. So the writers expect the government to play a role in making the processing of such plastic waste more economically viable through incentives. And again, the producers would require the help of the informal sector for this. So by pointing out these three major flaws in the draft regulations, the writers point out that the government is taking a retrograde backward step when it comes to waste management. Now let's take up a column from page number 15 of the online edition of The Hindu. In this column, the writer evaluates whether the freedom of speech guaranteed under the Indian Constitution is absolute. The writer is essentially examining whether hate speech can be protected under free speech and expression. This topic has come up for discussion because of a recent disturbing development that took place at Haridwar. As the state of Uttarakhand is headed towards elections, recently a religious congregation was held by a few radical religious leaders. During the summit at Haridwar, several religious leaders they gave an open call for violence against religious minorities. Even though police complaints have been filed against these radical religious leaders, not much action has been taken as of now, and some have argued that the hate speech of these radical religious leaders is covered under the freedom of speech and expression. Hence, the writer is examining to what extent is the freedom of speech and expression absolute, and tries to help us develop a constitutional and legal understanding of the restrictions that exist on the freedom of speech and expression. See, in the Indian Constitution, the fundamental right to free speech and expression is guaranteed under Article 19. As we all know, this right to free speech and expression is not absolute, and it comes with a set of reasonable restrictions. This fundamental right has been restricted on the grounds that if it violates the sovereignty and the integrity of the nation, or the security of the state, or friendly relations with foreign countries, or public order, decency, morality, in relation to contempt of court, defamation, or incitement to an offense. On all these grounds that I just stated, Article 19 has been restricted, thus making it very clear that right to free speech and expression is not absolute. To further help us understand this argument, the writer takes us back to the debates that took place within the Constituent Assembly when the Constitution was being drafted. In the draft Constitution, which was being debated in the Constituent Assembly by our Constitution makers, right to free speech and expression was included under Article 13 initially. During these initial debates related to Article 13, Dr. Ambedkar made it clear that free speech and expression cannot be absolute, but it has to come with reasonable restrictions. But several other members of the Constituent Assembly, they expressed concern that if restrictions are placed, then it could be misused by the government to curb free speech and expression. Several constitution makers stated that in the US Constitution, such restrictions on fundamental rights are not to be found because fundamental rights which were being included in the Indian Constitution was directly inspired by the Bill of Rights of the American Constitution. To this argument of the constitution makers, Dr. Ambedkar responded and he stated that fundamental rights under the American Constitution as well is not absolute. He said, for every right guaranteed under the American Constitution, there is a corresponding judgment by the US Supreme Court, which has placed reasonable restrictions on these rights, including the right to free speech and expression. So Dr. Ambedkar argued that in the American Constitution, fundamental rights are not absolute, and hence the same will have to be followed in the Indian Constitution as well, in order to ensure that the right to free speech and expression is not misused to promote violence and divisions in the Indian society. So later, when the final constitution was adopted, right to free speech and expression was covered under Article 19. And as we know, it's not an absolute right, but it comes with reasonable restrictions. Then in 1951, the constitution was amended for the first time to further expand these reasonable restrictions by including the term public order. See, prior to the first amendment to the Indian Constitution, the reasonable restrictions on free speech was limited to sovereignty and integrity of the nation, security of the state, India's relations with foreign countries, defamation, contempt of court, decency, morality, etc. But later, the Jawaharlal Nehru government felt that there was a need to include public order as well, because free speech was being misused to promote violence and polarization and divisions by spreading fake news and hatred through newspapers and publications. We can get further clarity on this by looking at the landmark observations of the Supreme Court in the Pravasi Balai Sangathan case of 2014. In this historic case, the Supreme Court recognized hate speech and stated that hate speech is an effort to marginalize individuals belonging to a particular group, and it seeks to promote hatred and violence against the targeted group. The Supreme Court recognized that hate speech results in the delegitimization of the group, either on the grounds of their religion, their caste, their language, sexual orientation, etc. The Supreme Court recognized that such targeted hate speech not only affects individuals of the group, but it also affects the entire society, as it makes the targeted group vulnerable to further discrimination, segregation, and violence. In this case, the Supreme Court even recognized the links between hate speech and genocide and ethnic violence. Based on these serious observations, the Supreme Court directed the Law Commission of India to examine the issue of hate speech. Accordingly, the Law Commission of India brought out the 267th report, in which it defined hate speech. Through this report, the Law Commission provided for a specific definition for hate speech, and it states that hate speech is an incitement to hatred primarily against a group of people who are defined in terms of their race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religious belief, etc. So after recognizing hate speech as a threat to the society, the Law Commission recommended that the current laws are not sufficient to tackle hate speech, and hence it recommended a new set of provisions to be included under the IPC or the Indian Penal Code. Accordingly, the Law Commission recommended the introduction of Section 153C and Section 505A into the Indian Penal Code to specifically deal with hate speech. As per the Law Commission's recommendation, Section 153C deals with prohibiting incitement to hatred. And Section 505A deals with causing fear, alarm, or provocation of violence in certain cases. These recommendations were designed by the Law Commission to specifically tackle hate speech, which clearly meant that it cannot be covered under right to free speech. But the other side of the argument is that if reasonable restrictions are further expanded, then even this will allow the government to restrict free speech even on genuine grounds. For example, we have seen numerous cases where the government has restricted the right to free speech of several intellectuals, artists, journalists, social activists, movie makers, etc. So then, how does one address this conflict? If free speech is absolute, it will even encourage hate speech. If free speech is restricted and if reasonable restrictions are expanded, it will allow the government to curb free speech, thus restricting dissent and criticism against the government. This conflict was addressed by the Supreme Court in the Pravasi Balai Sangathan case of 2014, where it remarked that there is no absence of laws to deal with hate speech. The problem is that our governments, that is both center and states, and our law enforcement agencies are very weak when it comes to execution and enforcement of existing laws and provisions. If the existing laws are effectively enforced, then the kind of hate speech we witnessed at Haridwar will not be tolerated and sufficient action will be taken against the culprits. But considering that the execution and enforcement is weak on political grounds, it is time for the government to look at the recommendations of the Law Commission, which clearly said that existing IPC provisions are not sufficient to deal with hate speech. In fact, the Law Commission even presented a draft bill in the 267th report itself, which included suggested amendments to IPC to introduce these two new sections. But the government and the parliament have not taken any action on this front, and this, accompanied with weak enforcement of existing laws by law enforcement agencies, has allowed such dangerous hate speech to flourish in the country. Now let's look at another column from page number 6, in which the writers examine the Election Laws Amendment Bill 2021, which was recently passed in the Lok Sabha without much debate. This bill brings changes to the Representation of Peoples Act and provides for the linking of Aadhaar with voter ID cards. The Election Commission and the government have justified this amendment bill as a necessary electoral reform which could help in tackling electoral fraud by removing duplicates and fake voters from the voting list. And in the long run, it could also facilitate remote online voting in India's electoral process. The argument of the Election Commission and the government is that currently the electoral list has a number of flaws, including the presence of duplicate and fake voters. So by linking Aadhaar with voter ID cards, such fake enlistments can be weeded out in order to clean up India's electoral list. But however, critics of the bill have raised serious concerns based on the examples of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, where a pilot project was implemented to link Aadhaar with voter ID cards. According to the writers, this pilot project in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana is being implemented from several years, and they claim that this linking exercise has resulted in the exclusion of 2 million voters from the voting list. They express a very serious concern that if Aadhaar is linked with voter ID cards, it could allow the ruling party in power, either at the center or at the state level, to misuse the information to exclude certain targeted voters who may not vote for them. And if this platform is used to enable remote online voting, then the ruling parties in power could easily take up voter profiling by clubbing electoral data with surveillance data, which could further allow them to specifically target a few voters, thus leading to voter suppression, maybe even voter manipulation through micro-targeting campaigns, or even resulting in the exclusion of the voter from the entire electoral process, thus leading to their disenfranchisement. They point out that if Aadhaar and smartphone-based voting is enabled by linking them with voter ID cards, then digital data could be harvested by political parties to specifically target few groups of voters and to manipulate their voting choices. Such data-enabled online voting would give parties access to intimate data such as facial recognition, biometrics, and even their political preferences. Then, based on this data, political parties can run micro-targeting campaigns to manipulate the voter and their opinions, or even to entirely suppress and disenfranchise the voter by excluding them from the voter list. Then, moreover, the amendment bill doesn't take into account the possibility of cyber threats on an electronic voting system, which could expose sensitive electoral data to hostile elements. This raises the risk of external manipulation of Indian elections, which in itself is a grave security threat. Plus, the writers also point out that Aadhaar in itself is not entirely foolproof because there have been several instances where fake and duplicate Aadhaar IDs have been generated. And how can an identification system, which in itself is not foolproof, can be used to verify voters on the voter list? So these arguments being made by the writers presents the other side of the argument, whereas the government and the election commission are pushing for these changes as a necessary electoral reform. Next, on page number 6, we have an editorial that is related to AFSPA. This topic is in news because of a botched army operation in Nagaland, which led to the killing of several innocent civilians, following which there has been a strong demand in the northeastern states for withdrawal of AFSPA. I have covered this topic in complete detail on the 6th of December in our Hindu analysis, and I have even covered the merits and demerits of AFSPA in our explained video on the 17th of December. But the editorial here provides an important update that following demands for withdrawal of AFSPA from Nagaland, the Union Ministry of Home Affairs has constituted a high-powered committee which will be headed by Additional Secretary Northeast along with other senior officials from the center and the state. This committee also has representation from Central Armed Police Forces such as Assam Rifles and CRPF, and it also has the representation of the Civil Administration of Nagaland such as the state's Chief Secretary. So this committee has been given a mandate to review the continuance of AFSPA in Nagaland and submit a report within 45 days, recommending whether the law should continue or should it be withdrawn. So according to the editorial, this development in itself is a very big development because the center has finally taken into account the opposition coming from northeastern states against AFSPA, and the constitution of this committee marks a step towards the review and possible withdrawal of AFSPA, which has become a very, very controversial law in the northeastern states. So I would request you to go and watch these videos and then go through the editorial once. Next, according to this article on page number 8, the Government of India and the administration of Jammu and Kashmir have decided to open up the real estate of Jammu and Kashmir to all Indian citizens. See, previously when J&K had a special status under Article 370, land ownership in J&K was restricted under Article 35A, according to which only the permanent residents of the state who are designated by the State Assembly could be eligible to buy property in Jammu and Kashmir. This special protection offered to permanent residents of the state was a part of the commitment that India had made to J&K when J&K integrated into the Indian Union in 1947. This special provision under Article 35A was an extension of the special status granted under Article 370, which was intended to protect the cultural rights and resources of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. But now with the withdrawal of special status under Article 370 and with the removal of Article 35A, J&K no longer enjoys the special status and the special provision. And through the newly introduced Jammu and Kashmir Development Act, the central government and the administration of the Union Territory of J&K have decided to throw open real estate for all Indian citizens. So this change will allow Indians from any part of the country to purchase property in Jammu and Kashmir, and the government is hoping that this will help in driving investments into J&K, which could help in the promotion of growth and development of J&K's economy. But however, the regional parties of Jammu and Kashmir have opposed these changes as it threatens to affect the cultural and economic interests of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question. Examine the recently published draft regulations on extended producer responsibility with regard to plastic waste management. The second question. Is the freedom of speech absolute under the Indian Constitution? Critically evaluate. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.